He had built an empire with his bare hands, but he couldn't buy his daughter one good man. 66 years old, one lung slowly failing, and Gideon Blackridge had everything Montana could offer except the one thing that kept him awake at night. Wealthy suitors came to his door wearing pressed shirts and rehearsed smiles. Every single one of them looked at Eliza the way a man looks at a prize stallion, calculating the value before the purchase, and every single one of them made Gideon's stomach turn. Then one morning, a dusty ranch hand did something nobody noticed. Gideon noticed. If you've ever trusted someone completely and discovered you were right, stay with me until the very end. Like this video and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The morning Gideon Blackridge decided to find his daughter a husband, he was standing at the fence line watching a horse die. Not dramatically, not with any kind of dignity. Old Copper, the roan gelding he'd ridden for 11 years across every acre of the Blackridge spread, had simply lain down in the mud beside the water trough sometime before dawn and couldn't get back up again. His breathing was shallow and wet. His eyes, still kind even now, tracked Gideon's face without panic. Gideon crouched beside him in the cold mud. He was 66 years old and his knees screamed about it. He put one weathered hand on the horse's neck and stayed there for a long time, saying nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. After a while, he heard boots behind him. "You want me to get Doc Pruitt?" said the voice. Young, careful. Gideon didn't look up. "Pruitt's a people doctor." "Yes, sir, I know that." A pause. Then the young man crouched down on the other side of Copper, not saying anything else, just placing a steady hand on the horse's flank. Gideon finally looked up. It was Silas Boone, one of the newer hands, hired on about 8 months back to help with the spring gather. 29 years old, quiet as a fence post, and about as easy to read as one, too. They stayed like that together for nearly 20 minutes, neither of them speaking, until Copper took one long rattling breath and didn't take another. Silas stood up slowly. He took off his hat, held it against his chest. That was all. It was such a small thing, such a completely unremarkable thing. Gideon never forgot it. Gab. He had come to Montana in 1847 with $32, a mule, and a stubbornness that his own mother had described as a personal failing. He'd broken ground that most men refused to look at twice. Rocky, uneven, punishing land that sat too high for easy farming and too exposed for comfortable living. He'd lost 2 cattle herds to early blizzards, lost a bunkhouse to fire, lost 3 years of profit to a beef market that collapsed without warning. He'd also lost his wife. Margaret Blackridge had died in the winter of 1874, the year Eliza turned 15, and Gideon had handled that loss the way he handled every other problem in his life, by working so hard he didn't have time to fall apart. He'd built fences, re-timbered the main barn, expanded the herd, dug 2 new wells, hired on 6 more hands. He'd worked himself from sunrise to well past dark for 3 solid years, and somewhere in the middle of all that motion, the grief had slowly changed into something quieter, something he carried instead of something that carried him. By 1888, the Blackridge Ranch ran 4,200 acres, carried just over 800 head of Hereford cattle, and employed 16 full-time hands plus seasonal help during gather and roundup. The main house sat on a low rise above the river bend, 2 stories, solid timber, with a porch that faced west so you could watch the sun go down over the mountains if you had the patience to sit still long enough. Gideon rarely had that patience anymore. He stood on that porch the evening after Copper died, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hand, staring out at nothing in particular. His left lung had been giving him trouble since February, a deep, persistent ache that Dr. Pruitt had explained in careful language that essentially translated to, "You have less time than you think you do." Gideon had thanked him politely and gone back to work, but that was before this morning, before he'd knelt in the mud beside a dying horse and felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific weight of things left unfinished. He heard the screen door open behind him. "You didn't come in for supper," said Eliza. "I wasn't hungry." She came and stood beside him. She was 30 years old now, his daughter, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, with her mother's jaw and her father's particular brand of stubbornness that she would never in a million years admit to having. She'd had suitors, several. Gideon had watched each one arrive with their best manners and their family names, and their careful compliments, and he'd watched Eliza endure them the way you endure a persistent headache. Politely, patiently, without any real interest. "Copper's gone," he said. "I heard." She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "I'm sorry, Dad." He had a good run. They stood in silence for a moment. A coyote called from somewhere south of the tree line. The mountains were going purple in the last light. "That Boone boy," Gideon said finally. Eliza glanced at him. "What about him?" "He stayed with Copper this morning, when I was out there." Gideon took a sip of his cold coffee and made a face. "Didn't ask any questions. Didn't try to say anything useful. Just stayed." "He's quiet," Eliza said carefully. Gideon looked at her sideways. There was something in the way she said it. Not dismissal, not disinterest. Just the particular tone a person uses when they've already thought about something more than they want to admit. He filed that away without comment. "Buzz?" The next morning, Gideon called his foreman, Hector Baines, into the office before breakfast. Hector had been with the ranch for 19 years. He was 54, built like a barn door, and had a face that looked like it had been assembled in a hurry from leftover parts. He was also one of the few people on Earth whose opinion Gideon actually trusted. "Tell me about Silas Boone," Gideon said. Hector settled into the chair across the desk. He thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought, which was one of the things Gideon appreciated about him. He didn't rush to say the first thing that came to mind. "Good worker," Hector said finally. "Better than good. He doesn't make a show of it, which some of the other boys find irritating. You know how men get when somebody outworks them without acting like they're doing it on purpose." "Any complaints?" "Not one. I've had him on fence repair, on the night watch, on the cattle sort last October. Never a problem. Never had to tell him something twice." Hector paused. "He keeps to himself mostly. Eats with the other men but doesn't run his mouth much. I've seen him break up 2 arguments in the bunkhouse just by walking into the room, which is a talent if you ask me." Gideon nodded slowly. "You got family?" "Don't think so. Came up from Wyoming, I believe. Never said much about where he was before that." Hector watched his employer's face. "You thinking of moving him up?" "I'm thinking," Gideon said, "about a number of things." Hector knew better than to push. "Ida-san, what Gideon was thinking about, specifically, was the particular problem of wealth and what it did to people, or more precisely, what it did to the people who wanted it. He'd watched it happen his whole life. Men who were decent and hardworking before money arrived, and something slightly different after. Not villains, not monsters, just shifted. Like a fence post that had moved 2 inches in the ground. You might not notice right away, but over time the whole line goes crooked. He'd had 3 serious suitors come calling for Eliza in the last 2 years alone. The first was Warren Aldrich, son of the Aldrich cattle operation up near Helena. Warren was 28, handsome in a practiced sort of way, and spoke with the careful confidence of a man who had never in his life been told no by anyone who mattered. He'd taken Eliza riding twice, complimented her intelligence in a tone that suggested he found it somewhat surprising, and then made the mistake of discussing the Blackridge land holdings with Gideon in a way that revealed he'd already done rather detailed calculations. Gideon had thanked him for his visit and not invited him back. The second was a lawyer from Billings named Charles Pruitt, who wore suits that cost more than a cowhand made in 4 months, and who talked about the future of the territory in the way that people talk about things they want to sound interested in without actually being interested in them. Eliza had described the evening as educational, and then gone to bed early, which was a diplomatic way of saying she'd rather have spent it with a fence post. The third, this one Gideon felt the worst about, because the man wasn't bad, just wrong, was a rancher named Tom Haskell, who genuinely liked Eliza and told her so directly, which was more than could be said for the other 2. But Tom Haskell wanted a wife the way a man wants a good horse, for the practical value of the thing, for what it would accomplish. Eliza saw it within 20 minutes, and Gideon saw it the moment he watched Tom's eyes track around the Blackridge operation during dinner, doing math. The trouble was not that these men were failures as human beings. The trouble was that Gideon had spent 4 decades learning to read character, and what he read in every one of them was a fundamental calculation that they couldn't entirely hide. What does this get me? He didn't blame them for it. He'd done his own calculations when he was young and hungry and had nothing. But he knew the difference between a man who had learned to move past that calculation and a man who was still running it. What he'd seen that morning at the fence, with Silas Boone kneeling in the mud beside a dying horse he had no obligation to mourn, that was a man who wasn't calculating anything. That was a man who was just there, squat. Over the following 2 weeks, Gideon found reasons to watch Silas Boone without appearing to. It wasn't difficult. A ranch that size had 1,000 moving parts, and the owner could walk anywhere he liked at any time without raising eyebrows. He rode out to the east pasture where Silas was repairing a section of line fence that had buckled under winter ice. He stopped to check the water levels at the south well where Silas happened to be replacing a rusted pump fitting. He wandered through the equipment barn on a Tuesday afternoon and found Silas oiling a piece of harness that didn't belong to him and that nobody had asked him to touch. "That's Caldwell's," Gideon said, nodding at the harness. Silas looked up. "Yes, sir. I noticed the stitching was starting to go on the cheek piece. Figured if it broke out on the range, that'd be a problem." "Caldwell know you've got it?" "I left him a note." Gideon studied him for a moment. Silas met his gaze directly, without aggression, but without flinching. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just explaining a fact. "Carry on," Gideon said, and walked on through the barn. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and he was frowning. Not with displeasure, but with the particular expression of a man who has been suspecting something for 2 weeks and has just found another piece of evidence in favor of it. The thing that struck him most about Silas Boone was not what the young man did. It was what he didn't do. He didn't complain. He didn't seek credit. He didn't position himself near the owner when the owner was visible. He didn't laugh too loudly at the boss's jokes or fall silent in a way designed to seem thoughtful. He wasn't performing anything. He just worked. With a consistency and a quiet attention to detail that Gideon found, frankly, a little remarkable. He'd employed hundreds of men over the years. Most of them were decent. Some of them were exceptional. But there was a quality Silas had that Gideon had only seen a handful of times in his life, and he didn't have a clean word for it. The closest he could get was this: Silas behaved exactly the same whether anyone was watching or not. That was rarer than gold. And what Gideon didn't know, what he had no way of knowing at this point, was that Silas Boone was engaged in his own private war. He'd been watching Eliza Blackridge for 8 months. Not the way Warren Aldrich had watched her, with that predatory appreciation for something valuable. Not with calculation. He'd watched her the way you watch something that you have no right to want and know you never will. Helplessly, quietly, with a discipline born of knowing exactly what his situation was. She was a rancher's daughter. He was a ranch hand. The mathematics of this were not complicated. He'd seen her handle a dispute between 2 of the seasonal workers with a calmness and fairness that surprised him, because most women of her class and time period would have left that to the foreman. He'd seen her up before dawn in the calving barn when they were short-handed, her sleeves rolled up, doing work that wasn't expected of her without a word of complaint. He'd heard her correct the ranch's bookkeeper once, politely, firmly, and completely correctly, on an accounting error that the bookkeeper hadn't noticed. She was not a soft woman. She was not a decoration. And every time Silas found himself in her orbit, he made a point of looking somewhere else, because looking at something you couldn't have was a kind of punishment he'd learned to avoid. What he didn't know was that Eliza Blackridge had very sharp eyes. Bison. On a Thursday morning in late April, Gideon rode out to the south pasture alone. He found Silas mending the lower gate hinge, which had rusted out over the winter. It was a small, unpleasant job. Cold metal, awkward angles, the kind of task that got assigned to new men because nobody else wanted it. Gideon dismounted, looped his reins over the fence post, watched for a while. "How long has that been failing?" he asked. Silas glanced up briefly. "Noticed it last month, put it on the list, but the list was long." He turned a bolt deliberately. "Figured I'd get to it before gather." "Hector put you on this?" A brief pause. "No, sir." Gideon nodded slowly. He leaned against the fence and looked out across the south pasture, where maybe 200 head were grazing in the thin spring sunshine. His chest ached with that familiar dull weight. He breathed through it. "You like this work?" he asked. Silas considered the question seriously, which Gideon appreciated. He didn't answer immediately just to fill the silence. Most days, Silas said, it's honest. That matter to you? Honest? More than most things, I suppose. He set down the wrench and looked up at Gideon directly for the first time in the conversation. His eyes were dark brown, steady, and had a quality that Gideon had spent the last 2 weeks trying to name. There are easier ways to make a living. There are, Gideon agreed. Why don't you pursue one? Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm not good at pretending to be something I'm not. Gideon looked at him for a long time. The wind moved through the spring grass. Somewhere up on the rise, one of the young heifers let out a complaint about something. No, Gideon said finally. I don't imagine you are. He remounted his horse and rode back toward the house, and Silas watched him go with the faint, careful expression of a man who isn't sure what just happened, but suspects it might matter. Mo. That evening, Gideon sat at the roll-top desk in his study for 2 hours. He had a glass of whiskey he barely touched. He had a ledger open in front of him that he wasn't reading. He was thinking about his daughter. He was thinking about the ranch. He was thinking about a December 3 years ago when the doctor had first used the word permanent in connection with the damage in his left lung, and the way Gideon had driven home through the snow afterward with both hands tight on the reins and the cold burning his face and the clearest, most specific fear he'd ever felt in his life sitting in his chest like a stone, not fear of dying. He'd made his peace with that a long time ago, fear of leaving Eliza in the wrong hands. She was strong, his daughter, stronger than people credited her for. But strength alone didn't protect a woman in 1888 Montana. A woman needed a partner who would protect the things she'd built, honor what she valued, and treat the ground she stood on as worth defending. Not because she couldn't do it herself, she could, but because doing it alone was an exhausting, grinding, relentless business, and Eliza Blackridge deserved better than exhaustion. She deserved someone who would still be honest when nobody was looking. Gideon closed the ledger, finished his whiskey, put out the lamp. In the morning, he was going to start testing a ranch hand named Silas Boone, and he was going to do it so carefully, so quietly, that Silas would never know the tests were happening at all. If the young man was what Gideon thought he would pass everyone without trying. If he wasn't, well, Gideon would know that too. He climbed the stairs slowly, his knees aching, his chest tight with that familiar weight, and he paused at the top of the landing and looked out the small hall window at the dark ranch spread below him, the barns, the corrals, the bunkhouse light still burning, the mountains above it all black against the stars. Everything he'd built, everything he'd fought for. He pressed one hand briefly against the cold glass. Hold on a little longer, he thought. Not to the ranch, not to his health, to his judgment, to his instinct, which had kept him alive and solvent through 40 years of the hardest kind of work there was. He needed it to be right one more time, just once more. The first test was so simple it was almost insulting. Gideon left a folded $20 bill on the floor of the equipment shed, right there in the open, between the workbench and the door, in a place where any man walking through would see it immediately. $20 was more than 3 weeks' wages for a ranch hand in 1888. It was not a small amount. It was the kind of money that could disappear into a pocket without anyone being the wiser because nobody knew it was there in the first place. Gideon told nobody about it. He didn't mark the bill. He simply placed it there on a Tuesday morning before anyone else was up and went about his day. By noon, the money had not moved. By late afternoon, Silas came into the main house and knocked on the office door. He was holding his hat in one hand and the folded bill in the other. Found this in the equipment shed this morning, he said. Figured it probably fell out of somebody's coat. Gideon looked at the bill, then at Silas. Whose coat do you figure? Silas shrugged. No way to know. Thought maybe you could ask around. Could be one of the seasonal boys needs it more than they're saying. Gideon took the bill. I'll look into it, he said. Silas nodded, put his hat back on, and left. Gideon sat for a moment with the $20 in his palm. He was not a sentimental man, and he tried not to be a foolish one, so he didn't put too much weight on a single act. Men returned money for different reasons. Some did it from genuine honesty. Some did it because they were afraid of being accused of stealing. Some did it because they wanted to be seen doing the right thing. The part that stayed with him was the last thing Silas had said. Could be one of the seasonal boys needs it more than they're saying. He hadn't thought about who the money belonged to in terms of who might be blamed for losing it. He'd thought about it in terms of who might need it most. That was a particular way of thinking. Not everyone had it. Gideon put the money in his desk drawer. He had 4 more things he wanted to know. The second test took more planning. 2 weeks into May, Gideon asked Hector to reassign Silas to overnight watch on the south pasture, where the younger heifers were starting to drop their first calves. It was the loneliest work on the ranch. Cold nights, long hours, nothing but a lantern and your own thoughts, and the occasional sound of something moving in the dark. It was the kind of assignment that revealed a man's character in the specific way that isolation always does, because there was no audience. Nobody to perform for. Just the work and the dark and whatever you actually were when nobody was looking. Gideon rode out to check on him at 2 a.m. on the third night. He expected to find Silas dozing against a fence post, which would have been forgivable and very human and also useful information. Instead, he found him crouched in the dirt beside a first-time heifer who had been struggling since before midnight. Her calf was turned wrong. It happened sometimes with young mothers, and it was a problem that required patience more than strength. Patience and the specific kind of calm that kept a frightened animal from making things worse. Silas had his sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold. His hands and forearms were wet and dark in the lantern light. The heifer was breathing hard, her eyes rolling, but she wasn't thrashing anymore. Somehow he'd kept her steady. Gideon dismounted and came forward slowly so he wouldn't spook her. "How long?" he said quietly. "Since about 11. Silas didn't look up. "She's close now. Calf's coming around." "You need help?" "I need her to stay calm, mostly." A pause. "She's been better the last little while." Gideon crouched on the other side of the heifer and put his hand on her neck the same way he'd done with Copper 2 months before. She shuddered once and then settled. 20 minutes later, the calf came into the world in a slippery, ungraceful rush that was messy and exhausting and nothing like anything romantic. Silas caught it, cleared its airway, got it breathing. The heifer struggled to her feet and turned around with the particular dazed urgency of a new mother, and Silas stepped back out of the way and let the two of them alone. He was breathing hard. He wiped his forearm across his face. In the lantern light, he looked about as tired as a man could look without falling over. "Good work," Gideon said. Silas looked at him. "Just the job." "Nobody would have known if you'd let her go," Gideon said. Not as an accusation, just as an observation. Something shifted in Silas's expression. Not offense, but something quieter, like the statement didn't quite compute. "I would have known," he said. Gideon rode home in the cold dark and didn't sleep, which was becoming his habit. The third test was the one Gideon thought about the most afterward, because it was the one most likely to fail a decent man. He had Hector tell Silas that he was being asked to handle the sale of 12 head of prime breeding stock to a buyer in Billings, a man named Garrett, whom Gideon had done business with for years. The cattle were worth $1,100 together, maybe 12 if Garrett was feeling generous. Hector gave Silas the numbers, the paperwork, and specific instructions. Get no less than $90 a head, take cash, bring it back same day. Gideon watched him ride out from the porch that morning. He watched without letting himself think too hard about what he was doing, because if he thought about it too hard, he might recognize it as a test that had a real cost attached to failure, and then he might talk himself out of it. Silas came back that evening. He handed Hector the cash, $1,080, exactly $90 a head. Then he handed him a separate folded piece of paper. Hector brought both to Gideon. The paper was a handwritten account of every single expense from the trip. The river crossing fee, 25 cents. The midday meal, 30 cents. A replacement buckle on the lead rope that had snapped during the drive, 15 cents. Total expenses, 70 cents, which Silas had paid out of his own pocket and had not deducted from the sale proceeds. At the bottom of the paper, in a handwriting that was careful and a little cramped, like a man who'd taught himself to write later than most. Cattle in good condition on arrival. Garrett said to tell you the line on the second heifer is the best he's seen from your operation. Gideon stared at that piece of paper for a long time. He could have taken more from Garrett and reported less. He could have padded the expenses significantly, and nobody would have blinked. He could have not written any of it down at all. Instead, he'd kept a record that nobody asked him to keep, paid a dime and a half out of his own wages, and passed along a compliment from the buyer because he thought Gideon might like to hear it. Hector was standing in the doorway of the office, watching Gideon's face. "You want to tell me what's going on?" he asked. He'd been patient for 6 weeks. That was about his limit. Gideon folded the paper carefully and put it in the desk drawer with the $20 bill. "Not yet," he said. Hector made a sound that communicated significant skepticism and left. Through all of this, Eliza was watching too, though not with the deliberate, structured attention her father was applying. Eliza's observations were less organized and considerably harder to dismiss. She'd noticed Silas Boone the way you notice a loose thread on a coat. Not dramatically, just persistently. There was always something small, the way he moved horses, with a patience that seemed almost unnecessary until you understood that the horses were calmer for it and worked better afterward, which meant it wasn't unnecessary at all. The way he spoke to the younger hands, not with the performative authority of a man trying to establish himself, but with the flat, practical directness of someone who'd figured out that people cooperated better when you treated them like adults. She saw him once, on a Wednesday morning, talking to old Devereaux, who was 61 and going deaf in his left ear, and had been with the ranch since before Eliza could remember. Devereaux had made a mistake with the cattle sort the previous day, a significant mistake that had cost 2 hours of extra work, and Silas had been the one to catch it and correct it, which meant he'd also been the one who had to tell Devereaux about it. She'd been too far away to hear what was said, but she'd watched the whole thing. Silas had positioned himself on Devereaux's right side, the good ear, and he'd kept his voice low and his posture easy, and whatever he'd said had left the old man nodding and going back to work without the particular hunch-shouldered shame of someone who'd been made to feel small. That could have gone a dozen ways. Most men would have handled it badly, either too harsh or too careful, and either one would have stung. Silas had handled it like he understood that dignity was something worth protecting even in small moments. Eliza found herself thinking about that for the rest of the day, which annoyed her. She had a complicated relationship with the idea of marriage. Not with marriage itself, she understood its practical value, particularly in her situation, and she wasn't foolish enough to pretend otherwise. But with the version of it that kept showing up at her door, the Warren Aldriches of the world, the Charles Pruitts, men who arrived already knowing what they wanted her to be and spending the entire courtship trying to reshape her toward that picture, usually with the specific combination of flattery and condescension that men deployed when they wanted something but weren't willing to admit it was something they wanted. She was 30 years old. She was well past the age when women in the territory were expected to have settled the marriage question. She knew what people said, not to her face, because her father's standing in the valley made direct rudeness impractical. But she knew the shape of the conversation that happened when she wasn't in the room. Willful, particular. Too much her father's daughter. She had stopped minding about that sometime around her 27th birthday. What she hadn't stopped minding was the loneliness that nobody talked about, the specific loneliness of being surrounded by people and still not having one of them who saw you clearly, who saw the whole of you and wasn't threatened by it, or excited by it, or trying to manage it, just saw it. She was not sure that person existed. She was not sure she hadn't invented the idea of him from some combination of books and wishful thinking, and her memory of watching her parents together when she was small. The particular ease between them, the way they could disagree about something in the morning and still want each other's company by nightfall. She thought about that sometimes, and it made her tired in a way that was hard to explain. What she did not do, what she was very deliberate about not doing, was let herself think about Silas Boone in any organized way. He was a ranch hand. He was 9 years younger than her father had been when her parents married, and 9 years younger than every expectation the valley had about who Eliza Blackridge should end up with. He was quiet and careful, and she'd watched him do a dozen small things with a consistency that she found genuinely unusual, but that didn't mean anything except that he was a decent worker. She told herself this with some regularity. It helped, moderately. The fourth test was the one that nearly broke Silas. In the third week of May, Gideon had Hector assign Silas to take over the repair of the north fence line, a stretch of about 3 miles along the rocky ridge above the river that had been failing in sections for 2 years. Every foreman before Silas had looked at it, started on it, and eventually come back with the same report. The ground was too rocky for proper post anchoring, the grade was too steep for the wagon to carry materials efficiently, and the expense of doing it properly would outpace any practical benefit from keeping cattle off that corner of the property. Gideon had nodded each time and done nothing because he wanted to see what would happen when someone who hadn't already decided it was impossible looked at it fresh. Silas looked at it for 2 days. He walked the whole 3 miles twice, studied the rock formations, paced the grade in different spots. He came back on the 3rd morning and asked Hector if he could have 2 men for a week and access to the timber in the lower woodlot. "What for?" Hector said. "The post problem isn't the rock," Silas said. "It's where people have been trying to put the posts. There are decent anchor points every 40 feet or so if you know where to look. The grade's a problem for a wagon, but not for a mule string. We could run material up in sections." Hector looked at him, the way experienced men look at younger ones who haven't yet learned to be discouraged by difficult things. 3 foremen said that fence couldn't be done proper. "I know," Silas said. "I'd like to try it anyway." Hector gave him the men and the mules and 2 weeks instead of 1 because he was underneath the barn door exterior, a practical man who understood that 3 weeks of effort on a job you might finish was worth more than none at all. It took 11 days. It was hard, physical, miserable work. Moving rock by hand, drilling anchor points into limestone, running material up a grade steep enough to make the mules complain loudly and with apparent feeling. There were setbacks. On the 6th day, a section they'd already finished pulled loose in a rainstorm and had to be redone. One of the 2 men Hector had assigned him developed a bad blister on his heel and couldn't work the last 3 days, so Silas and the remaining hand did the last stretch with half the crew. Gideon rode up to inspect it on a Thursday morning, the day after they finished. He sat his horse on the ridge and looked at 3 miles of solid, properly anchored fence stretching along terrain that 2 foremen before this one had described as impossible. His chest was doing its familiar ache. The mountains were bright and cold above the river valley. Silas was there, down at the far end, checking the last of the anchor posts. He hadn't seen Gideon arrive. Gideon watched him for a while, the way he moved along the line, not celebrating, not even appearing to take much satisfaction in the finished work. Just checking, making sure, looking for anything that might need correcting before he left it. That was the moment Gideon made up his mind. Not completely, not with the finality that he'd act on yet, but the direction of his thinking, which had been leaning one way for 2 months, settled into something more certain. The way a compass needle eventually stops oscillating and simply points. He had one more thing he needed to know. Not about Silas's honesty, not about his competence. Those 2 questions were answered. He needed to know what Silas Boone actually wanted, not what he worked for, not what he was capable of, but what he carried inside him that he'd never said out loud to anyone. Because a man's visible behavior could be shaped by any number of things. Fear, pride, reputation, the desire to be seen a certain way. But what a man wanted, at the center of himself when all the external pressures were removed, that was the thing that didn't change. That was the thing you couldn't fake for 4 months of invisible tests. Gideon wasn't ready to ask yet, but he was getting close. Meanwhile, in the bunkhouse that night, Silas lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about a 30-year-old woman with her mother's jaw and her father's stubbornness, and the particular way she'd looked at old Devereaux after the incident at the cattle sort. This quick, private look that said she'd seen what happened and registered the small mercy of it and filed it somewhere she didn't intend to share. He'd caught that look by accident. He wished he hadn't. He turned over on his side and closed his eyes and told himself, as he had told himself repeatedly for 8 months, that there was no version of this story where a man with nothing to his name except a bedroll and a talent for mending fences had any business thinking about Eliza Blackridge. He was right about that. He also couldn't stop. Outside, the Montana night was cold and clear and enormous, and the stars above the Blackridge ranch burned the same indifferent way they always did, paying no attention whatsoever to the quiet war being fought below them in the dark. The 5th test never happened. Gideon had planned it carefully. A situation involving the ranch's emergency fund, a locked strongbox in the barn office, and a set of circumstances that would give Silas both the opportunity and a plausible excuse to help himself to something that didn't belong to him. He'd worked out the details over 3 evenings at his desk, the kind of elaborate setup that required more planning than he wanted to admit. He never used it. On the first morning of June, he woke up at 4 in the morning with his chest burning in a way that was different from the usual ache, sharper, more insistent, like something had shifted inside him in the night and was trying to make itself known. He lay still for a long time in the dark, breathing carefully, waiting to see if it would pass. It did, eventually, but slowly. And when he finally got up and stood at his bedroom window watching the ranch come to life in the thin gray light, he understood something that he'd been avoiding understanding for the past several weeks. He was running out of time to be careful, not dramatically, not in the way of a man who'd just received a death sentence, but in the plain, practical way of a man who had been ignoring a credible warning for too long and was starting to feel the consequences of that in his chest at 4 in the morning. The winter was coming. Not this winter. Probably not this one. But a winter was coming, and between now and then he had one thing left to do that mattered more than anything else on this property. He knew what he'd seen in Silas Boone over 4 months of quiet watching. He didn't need a 5th test to confirm it. He'd known since the fence line, maybe before that, maybe since the morning at the water trough with Copper. He'd kept looking because looking felt safer than deciding, and deciding meant acting, and acting meant everything changed. He dressed in the dark, went downstairs, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table until the sun came up, working out exactly what he was going to say. He found Silas on the East Range just after 8, repairing a section of post where a young steer had rubbed himself against the wood all winter, and slowly worked 2 boards loose. It was the kind of minor maintenance that would have gone unnoticed for months if someone hadn't been paying attention. Silas had been paying attention. He looked up when he heard hoofbeats, then went back to what he was doing. He'd gotten comfortable enough around the owner to keep working when Gideon appeared, which was itself a kind of trust. The understanding that he didn't need to perform attentiveness when attentiveness was already obvious in the work. Gideon dismounted, tied his horse to the fence, stood there for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets, watching the younger man work. "Leave that a minute," he said. Silas set down the hammer, turned around. His expression was neutral but alert, the look of a man who has been called in from work by his employer and doesn't know the reason. "Ride with me," Gideon said. They went west toward the rise above the river bend, where the land opened up and you could see most of the ranch from one spot. The barns, the main house, the south pasture, the fence line along the ridge that Silas had finished 3 weeks ago. Gideon stopped there and sat his horse and looked at it all for a long moment. Silas waited. He was good at waiting. "I need to ask you something," Gideon said, "and I need you to answer me straight." "I'll try," Silas said. Gideon turned to look at him. "What do you want? Not from this ranch, not from the work. I mean, what do you actually want when you let yourself think about it?" The question sat between them in the morning air. Silas looked at the horizon. His jaw tightened slightly and then released, which was the only sign that the question had landed somewhere real. "That's a complicated thing to ask a man," he said. "I know it is. Answer it anyway." A long pause. A hawk turned slow circles above the river, and the new grass on the slope below them moved in the wind, and somewhere back toward the south pasture, a cow called for her calf with that flat carrying sound that meant she'd temporarily lost track of it. "I want a life that's mine," Silas said finally. "Not something I borrowed or stumbled into. Something I built with my own hands and can stand behind." He stopped. Started again, more carefully. "I want to matter to something. A piece of land. An operation. People." Another pause, and this one was longer, and when he continued, his voice was lower and more careful in the way a man sounds when he's saying something he's never said out loud. "I want the kind of life my father never figured out how to have." Gideon didn't ask about the father. He filed it away. "Is that all?" he said. Silas looked at him then, direct, a little wary. "What are you asking me, Mr. Blackridge?" "I'm asking if there's anything else, anything you want that you haven't said." The silence this time was different. Silas's eyes went back to the horizon, and something happened in his face. A tightening, a decision being made, and then a kind of surrender to the fact that he was apparently going to say it. "Your daughter," he said, flat, honest. "I know that's not a thing I have any right to say to you. I know what I am and what she is, and I'm not a fool about the distance between those two things. But you asked me what I want, and that's the truth of it." He looked back at Gideon. "I haven't acted on it. I never would. But you asked. Gideon looked at him for a long time. Silas held the gaze. He didn't flinch, and he didn't try to walk it back, and he didn't add anything to cushion what he'd just said. He just waited for whatever was coming, with the particular steadiness of a man who has decided that honesty is worth its consequences. How long? Gideon said. About 8 months? And you never said anything to her? No, sir. Never tried to put yourself in her path? No, sir. A brief, complicated pause. I moved out of it mostly, when I could. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. The hawk had finished its circles and gone. The wind moved through the grass on the slope. I'm going to tell you something, Gideon said, and I need you to sit still and hear all of it before you say anything. Silas nodded. For the past 4 months, I have been watching you. He said it plainly, without apology. The money in the equipment shed, the cattle sale, the night watch in the south pasture, the fence line on the north ridge. Every one of those things was something I arranged deliberately. Every one of them was a test. The look on Silas's face went through several things in quick succession. Surprise, confusion, a flicker of something that might have been anger, and then a stillness that replaced all of it. A test, he said. Yes. How many? 4. I had a 5th planned. I didn't use it. Silas was quiet. He looked out over the ranch and then back at Gideon, and there was something working behind his eyes that Gideon couldn't entirely read, which was unusual. Most men were easier to read than this one. You could have just asked me, Silas said. Any of those things. I could have, Gideon agreed. But asking a man who knows he's being evaluated tells you what he'll say. Watching a man who thinks he's just doing his job tells you what he is. Silas absorbed this. Something shifted in his jaw. Not anger exactly, but something effortful, like he was deciding how to feel about a complicated truth. What did you find? He said. Same thing every time. Gideon's voice was steady, without drama. A man who does the right thing when nobody's watching, because apparently that's just how you're put together. The wind moved between them. Silas's horse shifted its weight and settled. That fence on the north ridge, Gideon said. 3 men before you said it couldn't be done right. The anchor points weren't where they kept looking. I know, but they'd all looked at that fence and decided before they really tried. You looked at it like it was a problem that hadn't been solved yet. He paused. That's a particular way of thinking. Not everyone has it. Silas said nothing. He was listening with the specific quality of attention he gave to things that mattered, which meant his whole body was still and his eyes were steady, and he wasn't preparing a response so much as actually hearing what was being said. I built this ranch on 4,200 acres of land that everyone else said was too rocky and too exposed and too far from water, Gideon said. I've heard the word impossible from serious men my entire working life. It's never stopped meaning much to me. He looked at the spread below them, all of it, the barns and the fences and the cattle in the distance and the mountains above it all. I need to know it's going to be protected by someone who understands that the hard thing and the right thing are frequently the same thing. Silas turned to look at him with an expression that had gone careful in a different way. Sir? I'm not finished, Gideon said. Silas closed his mouth. The money, the cattle sale, the fence, those told me about your honesty and your competence. The night watch told me something else. He paused. You stayed up all night with a first calf heifer because you would have known if you hadn't. That's what you said. And I've been thinking about that ever since because it's the most honest thing I've heard a man say in a long time. Most people behave well because they're afraid of being caught behaving badly. You behave well because you can't seem to help it. Another pause. That's not common. Silas was looking at him with an expression that had stopped being guarded and was now something more complicated. Something that had the quality of a man who is not accustomed to being seen clearly and is not sure what to do when it happens. I'm 66 years old, Gideon said. My left lung is failing. Dr. Pruitt uses careful language, but what he means is that my time in charge of this operation is not unlimited. He said it without self-pity, the way you state a weather forecast. I have been looking for the right person to trust with everything I built, and I have been looking for the right person to trust with my daughter. I was not expecting those to be the same man. The silence stretched. The ranch, Silas said slowly, and Eliza. I'm not a man who trades his daughter for a ranch manager, Gideon said, and there was a brief edge in his voice. That's not what I'm saying. These are two separate things. I'm telling you that the same thing that tells me you can be trusted with this operation is the same thing that tells me you can be trusted with her. It's the same quality. It's not transferable and it's not purchasable, and every wealthy man who's come to my door in the last 2 years has been missing it. Silas said nothing. He seemed to be processing at the level below language, where things go when they're too large to immediately become words. You told me you have nothing worthy to offer her, Gideon said. That's the answer I expected from you. It tells me you understand the weight of it. He looked at the younger man. But you're wrong. Mr. Blackridge, a man who keeps an accounting of 70 cents worth of expenses when nobody asked him to, Gideon said. A man who puts a $20 bill in the boss's hand and thinks about who might need it most. A man who stays all night in the cold because he would have known. That man has something to offer my daughter. He stopped. He just doesn't know it yet. Silas looked like he was standing on uncertain footing and was trying to determine if the ground beneath him was solid. She doesn't know any of this, he said. No. What if she... He stopped, started again. What if she doesn't want what you've decided? And here Gideon did something that surprised Silas, which was to produce a sound that was close to a laugh. Short, genuine, slightly rueful. Son, Eliza has never once in her 30 years wanted what I decided. I'm not deciding this. I'm clearing the way. He looked at Silas steadily. What she wants is another question entirely, and the only way to find out the answer is to go ask her. You want me to speak to her? Tonight, Gideon said, before you think yourself out of it. Silas looked at the ranch below them. He looked at it for a long time. The sweep of it, the fences, and the buildings, and the grazing cattle, all of it sitting in the morning sun with the particular quality that places have when they've been built by someone who meant them to last. He thought about what it would mean to be responsible for all of it, the weight of that, the privilege of it. And somewhere inside all of that, he thought about Eliza Blackridge, who had her mother's jaw and her father's stubbornness, and who had looked at old Devereaux after the cattle sort with that quick, private, generous look, and the thinking became something more complicated than he could sort through on horseback on a Tuesday morning. I'm not the man your suitors were, he said. Not as a complaint, just as a fact. No, Gideon agreed. You're not. I don't have a family name. I don't have land. I have wages and a bedroll and a talent for fixing things that are broken. I know what you have, Gideon said. I've been watching it for 4 months. Silas looked at him. What if I say the wrong thing to her? What if I go to her tonight and I say it all wrong and she... Then you'll have said the wrong thing, Gideon said, and you'll figure out how to say it better. A pause. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be honest. You've been honest your whole life. Do it one more time. The sun had climbed higher while they talked. The shadows were shorter now, and the day was warming, and down below on the south pasture the cattle were beginning their slow drift toward the water. Everything looked the way it always did. The same landscape, the same operation, the same unchanging rhythm of a working ranch in early summer. But the whole shape of Silas Boone's life had just shifted by about 40 degrees, and he was still getting used to the new angle. I need to ask you something, Silas said. His voice was different now, lower, more careful. Go ahead. Why me? Not why me instead of the rich men. I understand that part. He looked at Gideon directly. Why me specifically? There are decent men everywhere. Men with better prospects, men who could offer her more. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the mountains, which were brilliant and cold above the valley, and had been there long before anyone now living and would be there long after, which was a thought he found neither comforting nor distressing, but simply true. The morning copper died, he said. You stayed with him. You took your hat off. A pause. I've employed hundreds of men in 40 years. You're the second one to do that. His voice was level, and he kept looking at the mountains. The first one was a good man. I should have kept him closer than I did. He turned to look at Silas. I'm not making the same mistake twice. Silas didn't say anything. There wasn't anything appropriate to say. They rode back toward the ranch in silence, which was a comfortable kind of silence. Not the absence of words, but the presence of something too large for words, which is its own different thing. At the gate, Gideon pulled up. One more thing, he said. Silas stopped. When you talk to her, and I mean when, not if, Don't try to make a case for yourself. Don't explain your worth or your intentions or your plans for the future. Gideon looked at him steadily. Just tell her the truth. What you told me this morning, up on the ridge. Say exactly that. The whole truth, Silas said. Every word of it. Silas nodded once. Then he rode toward the barn, and Gideon watched him go. This 30-year-old man with nothing to his name except a bedroll and a quality of character that couldn't be manufactured, and Gideon felt something release in his chest that wasn't the lung. It was something older than that, something he'd been holding for longer. He sat his horse alone at the gate for a while, in the June morning, with the mountains behind him and the ranch spread out below, and he breathed through the ache in his chest and looked at everything he'd built and thought about the fact that he'd spent 40 years asking himself what it was worth. He thought he might finally know. That evening, after supper, when the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and the kitchen had gone quiet, Eliza Blackridge took her coffee out to the garden as she often did in the long summer evenings. The light was going gold and the air smelled like cut grass and river water, and the particular clean smell of Montana in early June, and she sat on the low stone wall at the garden's edge and watched the light change on the mountains and tried not to think about the look her father had given her at dinner. This particular look, measuring and quiet and carrying something she couldn't name. She heard footsteps on the gravel path. She knew before she turned around. Silas Boone came around the corner of the garden wall and stopped when he saw her. He was holding his hat in both hands the way he had the morning Copper died, and his face had the look of a man who had decided something and was committed to it, and was also terrified, which was a combination Eliza had never actually seen on a man who was coming to talk to her. Every other man had arrived with confidence. Rehearsed confidence, mostly, the kind that covered what they actually wanted. This one looked like he'd rather be mending fence. "Miss Blackridge," he said. "Silas," she said. A pause. A long one. "Your father suggested I come speak with you," he said. "Did he?" It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." He looked down at his hat for a moment, then back up at her. "I want to tell you something. I'm probably going to say it badly." "Then say it badly," Eliza said. "That's fine." He took a breath, and he told her the truth. He said it badly. He had warned her he would, and he was right. He started in the middle, which was the wrong place to start, and then backed up and started again from somewhere earlier, which was better but still not quite right. And Eliza sat on the stone wall and watched him work through it with the particular patience of a woman who has spent 30 years surrounded by men who always knew exactly what they wanted to say, and she found, somewhat to her surprise, that she preferred this version considerably. He told her about 8 months of watching from a careful distance. He told her about moving out of her path deliberately, which made her go still in a way he didn't notice because he was looking at his hat again. He told her he understood the distance between his situation and hers, and that he wasn't asking her to ignore it. He told her that her father had told him about the tests, and that he wanted her to know he hadn't passed them for any reason he could calculate. He'd just done what seemed right at the time, which felt inadequate to say out loud, but was the only honest answer he had. Then he stopped, looked up at her. "I don't have a speech prepared," he said. "I don't have land or a family name or anything that would make this a reasonable thing to say to you. I just have the truth of it, which is that I've been in a quiet war with myself for 8 months trying not to feel what I feel, and your father asked me to stop fighting it and say it out loud instead." A pause. "So I did." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. The light was almost gone now, the mountains just dark shapes against a sky that had gone from gold to deep blue, and the garden smelled like the wild roses her mother had planted along the south wall the year before she died. "The day you talked to Devereaux," she said. "After the cattle sort." Silas blinked. "What about it?" "You stood on his right side, his good ear." He looked at her. Something crossed his face. Not quite recognition, more like the expression of a man realizing that a conversation he thought was private had had an audience. "He's been with this ranch longer than I've been alive," Silas said carefully. "Didn't see any reason to make him feel small about a mistake." "No," Eliza said. "You didn't." She set her coffee cup down on the wall beside her. "Most men wouldn't have thought about which side to stand on. Most men are in a hurry," he said. "You're not." "Not usually." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the direct, considering gaze that made a lot of people uncomfortable, and that Silas met without flinching, the same way he'd met her father's gaze on the East Range that morning, 4 months ago. I'm going to tell you something too, she said, because it seems like the thing to do. He waited. I have been very good at knowing what I don't want, Eliza said. 3 years of suitors, and I could tell you exactly, specifically, what was wrong with every one of them. And I was right. There was something wrong with every one of them. She paused. But knowing what you don't want is not the same as knowing what you do. And I had started to think maybe I was the problem. Maybe I'd made the requirements too particular. Another pause, and when she continued, her voice was quieter, with the quality of something being said for the first time. Then I watched you tell old Devereaux about his mistake, and I thought, that thing right there, that's what I've been trying to name. Silas was very still. I'm not saying yes to a marriage proposal, she said. You haven't made one. I'm saying yes to a conversation. I'm saying yes to finding out if what I think I saw over the past 8 months is what was actually there. She looked at him steadily. Can you do that? Just talk to me, like a person. That's about all I know how to do, he said. Good, Eliza said. Sit down then. You're making me nervous standing there holding your hat like that. He sat on the wall 6 feet away from her, which was a proper distance, and put his hat on the stone beside him, and they talked until the stars were out and the garden had gone dark around them, and the ranch was completely quiet except for the sound of the river in the distance. It was not a romantic conversation particularly. They talked about practical things. The north fence line, which she knew about and had opinions on. The heifer in the south pasture, whom she'd gone to see the next morning and whose calf she'd named privately without telling anyone. The cattle sale to Garrett and Billings, about which she said, very dryly, that writing down 70 cents of expenses was either extremely conscientious or slightly obsessive, and Silas said it was probably both, and Eliza laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one, and something shifted in the air between them. They talked about Wyoming, where he'd come from, which he described in the flat, careful way of someone editing as he went, and Eliza noticed the editing and didn't push at it because she understood that some things needed time before they became speakable. They talked about her mother, which surprised him. She brought it up herself, which most people didn't, as if talking about a dead person was impolite. She talked about Margaret Blackridge like she was still present in the ranch, in the rose bushes, in the kitchen where her recipe book was still on the shelf, in the way certain things were organized that nobody had changed because changing them felt wrong. She sounds like someone I would have liked, Silas said. Eliza looked at him. She would have liked you, she said. She had no patience for men who performed things. A pause. She would have watched you for about 10 minutes and made up her mind. What would she have decided? Eliza considered this with a seriousness that told him she was actually thinking about her mother and not just answering a question. That you were the kind of man who gets better the longer you know him, she said finally. She used to say that was the rarest kind. Silas didn't know what to do with that, so he didn't do anything with it. He just let it sit. When he finally stood to leave, the night had gotten cold, and she'd pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders, and neither of them had noticed when that happened. Same time tomorrow? He said. Not with confidence, with the tentative quality of someone who doesn't want to presume. Tomorrow I'll be in the east pasture checking the water levels before noon, Eliza said. If you happen to be out that direction for some reason. He picked up his hat. I might be. The timing would be coincidental, she said, with a perfectly straight face. Completely, he agreed. He walked back toward the bunkhouse in the dark and the cold, and the war he'd been fighting with himself for 8 months had not ended exactly, but it had changed character entirely, from a war of suppression to something more like navigation, which was harder in some ways and considerably better in others. What followed was 6 weeks of the most careful, complicated, entirely unromantic courtship in the history of Beaverhead County, Montana. They talked in the east pasture. They talked at the water trough. They talked on the porch after supper when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet and the mountains were dark above the valley. Gideon was present for exactly none of these conversations, which was deliberate on his part, and which both Silas and Eliza were privately grateful for. Hector Baines knew something was happening. He said nothing about it because he was a man who understood which things were his business and which were not. But he reorganized the work assignments with a subtle efficiency that gave Silas reasons to be in locations where Eliza happened to be. And he did this with such a straight face that anyone watching would have thought it was purely coincidental. It was not. The courtship was not smooth. There were evenings where the conversation ran dry, and they sat in an uncomfortable silence that neither of them knew how to fix. There were moments where Silas said something that came out wrong. Too blunt, too flat, not enough softness around the edges. And Eliza's expression went brief and complicated, and he spent the next 24 hours trying to figure out what he'd said and how to unsay it. There were moments where Eliza was withdrawn in a way he couldn't read, pulling back into herself with the particular self-containment she'd developed over years of not wanting things she couldn't have, and Silas would sit with the silence and not push at it, which was usually the right thing to do, and occasionally made her want to throw something at him. 3 weeks in, they had their first actual argument. It started over the water rights on the south branch of the river, a long-standing disagreement between the Blackridge operation and the neighboring Holt property, who had been encroaching on shared usage for years. Eliza had opinions about this. Specific, detailed, researched opinions that she'd developed over 2 years of watching the situation and that she'd never been able to voice fully because the men involved in the discussion consistently talked over her, as if she were there for decorative purposes. She was explaining her position to Silas on the porch after supper. The legal precedent, the survey records, the practical impact on summer cattle movement. And he listened to the whole thing and then said, carefully, "Have you told your father all of this?" She stopped. "What?" "He handles the property disputes. Have you given him this argument?" "The survey records specifically. That's the piece he'd need." "I've tried," she said, and there was an edge in her voice. "Twice." And he listened politely and then talked to the lawyer instead. She kept her voice even. "The lawyer has 1/3 of the information I have and has not reviewed the survey records." Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the dark yard. "That's frustrating," he said. "Considerably." Another pause. "I can look at the survey records if you want. I know where the markers are on the south branch. I went through that section twice on the fence project. If there's a discrepancy between what Holt's claiming and where the markers actually sit, I can tell you." Eliza looked at him. "That's not the point." "I know it's not," he said. "The point is that you've done the work and nobody listened. I'm saying I'll listen, and then I'll go out and verify what I can, and if it holds up, I'll tell Hector, and Hector will tell your father, and your father will think it's a new idea." He paused. "It's a bad system. It's an infuriating system." "Yes," he said simply. "It is." She looked at him for a moment. "You're not going to tell me I should present it differently, more softly, more like a suggestion than an argument?" "No," Silas said. "I'm going to look at the survey markers." The argument, such as it was, deflated. What replaced it was something more useful. The beginning of a working partnership, which was less exciting than romance and considerably more durable. He went out to the South Branch 2 days later. He came back with notes on the marker positions, which confirmed everything Eliza had said and added 2 additional discrepancies she hadn't caught because she hadn't had access to that section of the property in winter. He took it to Hector. Hector took it to Gideon. Gideon sent a letter to the Holt property that settled the dispute within 3 weeks. Gideon never asked where the survey information came from, but one evening at dinner, he looked at his daughter with that quiet, measuring look, and she met his gaze directly. And neither of them said anything, and the conversation moved on to other things. That was the moment Gideon understood the 2 of them were going to be all right. He kept this understanding to himself. He had learned over 66 years that saying these things out loud rarely improved them. 5 weeks into what nobody was officially calling a courtship, Silas found the letters. He hadn't been looking for anything. He'd been in the barn office tracking down a discrepancy in the equipment log when he found a stack of correspondence that had slipped behind the filing cabinet, and he pulled it out to put it back properly and saw, on top of the stack, an opened letter addressed to Gideon in a doctor's handwriting. He didn't read it. He put it on the desk. He stood there for a moment looking at it because the name at the bottom of the partial sentence visible in the fold said Dr. H. Pruitt. And the words he could see without trying to read it said progressive and function and prepare. He put the stack back in the filing cabinet. He went back to the equipment log. He finished the discrepancy and recorded the correction and locked the barn office and went to find Eliza. She was in the kitchen going through her mother's recipe book, which she did sometimes in the evenings. Not cooking, just reading, which Silas had come to understand was a kind of conversation she had with a woman she missed. "I need to ask you something," he said from the doorway. She looked up. Something in his face told her it wasn't a small question. "How much do you know," he said, "about your father's health?" The kitchen went quiet. The recipe book stayed open in her hands. "Enough," she said carefully. "The lung." "Yes." A pause. "How do you know?" "Found a letter by accident in the barn office. I didn't read it, but I saw enough." He stayed in the doorway. "Does he know that you know?" "No." Her voice was level, but her hands had gone still on the book. "He's protected me from it. He thinks he's being kind." "He is being kind," Silas said, "and it's also not fair to you." She looked at him. Her eyes were dry. She was not a woman who cried easily or publicly, but there was something in her face that was the shape of grief, held just below the surface where she'd been carrying it for however long she'd known. "It's been 2 years," she said, "since Dr. Pruitt told him." A pause. "He thinks I found out from one of the ranch wives. I've never corrected that impression. He's been carrying it alone. He's been carrying everything alone his whole life." There was no bitterness in it, just a fact. The same flat, honest delivery that Silas used when he said things that were simply true. "It's the only way he knows." Silas crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her at the table, which was something he didn't always do without being invited first. But this seemed like a moment that required proximity, not politeness. "He did all of this," Silas said carefully. "The tests, the watching. He did it because he's running out of time to get it right." "Yes." "And you knew that, while it was happening." "I suspected." She closed the recipe book. "I didn't know about the tests until he told me, but I knew he'd been looking at you differently for months. My father doesn't look at the hired hands the way he was looking at you." A pause. "I told myself it was about the foreman position." "You knew it wasn't." "I knew it wasn't," she admitted. "I just didn't know what to do with that." They sat across from each other at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the ranch quiet outside, and the weight of all of it, the dying father, the uncertain future, the two people sitting on either side of a table trying to figure out what they were to each other, settled over the room like weather. "I'm scared," Eliza said, flatly, without self-pity, just naming it. "Of what specifically?" "Losing him," she said. "Losing him before I'm ready, which is never going to happen, which means I'm going to lose him while I'm still not ready." She paused. "And of everything after. Running this place, making the decisions, being responsible for all of it." Another pause, and this one was harder. "Alone." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You're not alone," he said. She looked at him directly. "You don't know that yet." "No," he said, "but I know it more than I've known most things." He held her gaze. "I'm not going anywhere, Eliza. I'm not saying that as a promise I'm making to your father or to the ranch. I'm saying it to you." A beat. "You can argue with me about the water rights until we're both old and I'll still be here the next morning. That's just how it is." The lamp flickered once in a draft from under the door. The mountains outside the kitchen window were invisible in the dark. Somewhere down at the bunkhouse, someone was playing a harmonica badly, which was a nightly occurrence that everyone had stopped commenting on. Eliza looked at him for a long time. Then she opened the recipe book again to the page she'd been on and turned it so he could see. "My mother's apple cake," she said. "She made it every autumn. I've made it 3 times and it never comes out the same way twice." Silas looked at the page. The handwriting was faded and there were notes in the margins in a different hand. Adjustments, corrections, small additions that had accumulated over years of making the same thing. "What changes?" "The apples," she said. "Every year they're a little different. She said you had to know the apple before you could know how much sugar to use." A pause. "I've been using the same amount of sugar every time." "You need to taste them first," he said. "That's what she wrote," Eliza said, and tapped a faint line in the margin. "I keep forgetting." They stayed at the kitchen table for another hour, talking about nothing important, which was its own kind of important, and when Silas finally said goodnight and walked back to the bunkhouse through the cold June night, Eliza sat alone at the table for a while with the recipe book and the lamp and the particular feeling of someone who has been afraid of something for a long time and has just discovered that the fear hasn't disappeared but has become somehow more manageable. She did not sleep well that night, but she slept better than she had in 2 years. The proposal happened on a Saturday morning in late July, which was an unremarkable Saturday in most respects. Warm, clear, the kind of Montana summer morning that made you briefly forget what the winters were like. It was not elaborate. Silas was not an elaborate man. He found her at the corral fence, watching the yearlings, and he came and stood beside her, and they looked at the horses for a while, and then he said, "I've been trying to figure out how to do this properly." "And?" Eliza said, not looking at him. "I don't think there's a proper way that's also honest," he said. "So I'm just going to say it." "All right, I want to marry you," he said. "Not because your father asked me to think about it. Not because of the ranch, or what it would mean for either of us practically. Because I want to spend the rest of my life in the same house as a woman who remembers which ear old Devereaux hears out of, and corrects her own accounting without being asked, and reads her dead mother's recipes at night to keep a conversation going." He paused. "And because 7 months ago I made myself a promise to stop wanting things I thought I had no right to want, and I am very tired of keeping that promise." Eliza was quiet for a moment. The yearlings moved in the corral, and the morning sun was on the mountains, and somewhere in the distance Hector was shouting something at one of the younger hands that they were very obviously ignoring. "You said the rest of your life," she said. "Yes. That's a long time." "I'm counting on it," he said. She turned from the fence and looked at him. His hat was in his hands again, which she had come to understand was what he did when something mattered. This unconscious removal, like a small, involuntary act of respect. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Just yes? Did you want more than that?" "No," he said. No, that's exactly right." She turned back to the fence. He turned back to the fence. They stood there together watching the yearlings for a while, shoulder to shoulder in the morning sun, and it was perhaps not the most dramatic moment either of them would ever have, but it was theirs, which was better than dramatic. That afternoon, Silas walked to the main house and knocked on the office door. Gideon looked up from his desk. "She said yes," Silas said. Gideon set down his pen. He looked at the younger man standing in the doorway, dusty from the morning's work, hat still in his hands, with the particular expression of someone who is trying to look calmer than he feels. "Sit down," Gideon said. "I'd rather stand, if that's all right." "Suit yourself." Gideon leaned back in his chair. The afternoon light came through the west window and lay across the desk, and the old ledgers stacked on the shelf, and the framed photograph of Margaret that had been there for 14 years. He looked at Silas for a long moment. "You treat her well," he said. It was not a request. It was not quite a warning. It was something between the two. The statement of a man who is handing over the most important thing he has and needs to say out loud that he knows what he's doing. "I know what she's worth," Silas said. "I'm not going to forget it." Gideon nodded once. "There's paperwork," he said. "Legal things. We'll sort that out next week." He picked up his pen again. "Now, go do something useful. You've been standing around the corral all morning." Silas almost smiled. "How did you—" "I know everything that happens on this ranch," Gideon said, without looking up from the desk. "Always have." Silas put his hat on and went back to work. Gideon sat at the desk for a while after the door closed, not writing anything, just sitting with the afternoon light and the quiet house and the sound of the ranch outside the window. All the familiar sounds he'd been listening to for 40 years. The cattle, the horses, the creak of the barn door, the wind in the cottonwoods along the river. He put his hand flat on the desk, felt the worn wood under his palm. He'd built this desk himself a long time ago, from timber he'd cut on the North Ridge the first winter he'd owned the land. It was not a beautiful desk. It was heavy and slightly crooked, and one of the drawers had never closed quite right. But it had held up for 40 years under everything he'd put on it, which was a better record than most beautiful things managed. He pressed his palm against the wood and felt the solid, imperfect reality of it. Outside the window, the mountains caught the afternoon light and held it, the way they always did, without effort, without end. They were married that October, on a Saturday, in the ranch yard under a sky so blue it looked manufactured. It was a small wedding. Hector stood up for Silas, which surprised no one who actually knew Hector. and surprised everyone else. Eliza wore her mother's dress, which was slightly too short and had been let out at the waist at some point, and had a small repair on the left sleeve that was visible if you were looking for it. She wore it anyway, because the alternative was a dress that hadn't belonged to anyone she loved, and that seemed like the wrong trade. Old Devereaux cried at the ceremony, which he denied afterward with considerable force. 3 of the seasonal hands who'd been with the ranch for years attended without being invited and stood in the back, hats in their hands, which was the ranch hand version of a formal wedding gift. Gideon stood beside his daughter and walked her forward and then stepped back, because that was the whole of his job that day, and he did it without ceremony and without the weight of any moment being lost on him. When it was done, he shook Silas's hand. "Welcome to the family," he said. Silas looked at him. "Thank you for the tests," he said. Gideon raised an eyebrow. "Did they bother you?" "At the time, no, because I didn't know." A pause. "Now?" "A little." "Good," Gideon said. "A man who didn't mind being tested would be harder to trust." He released his hand. "Now go talk to your wife." Silas went. Gideon stood alone at the edge of the yard and watched the people his life had gathered, the hands and the neighbors, and the 2 of them at the center of it. Eliza laughing at something, Silas watching her with the expression of a man who cannot entirely believe his own circumstances. And he felt the ache in his chest, and felt the autumn sun on his face, and thought about Margaret, who would have been standing right here, and whose absence on a day like this was its own kind of presence. He breathed through the ache. He watched his daughter. He had done the thing he set out to do. Everything else was what came next. Everything else was what came next, and what came next was harder than any of them had expected, which was probably the most honest thing that could be said about the first year of a marriage under the shadow of a dying man's ticking clock. Silas moved into the main house after the wedding, which was a transition that felt stranger than he'd anticipated. Not because of Eliza. They settled into the same space with a practicality and occasional friction that felt like real life rather than anything idealized, which suited them both. But the house itself carried 40 years of Gideon Blackridge, in the worn path on the kitchen floorboards, and the particular way the west window stuck in cold weather, and the roll-top desk that sat in the office like a piece of the man himself, heavy and slightly crooked and absolutely immovable. Silas did not try to change things. He understood, without being told, that the house was not yet his to change. Maybe it never fully would be, and that was fine. He moved around the existing architecture of the place the way he moved around the existing architecture of the ranch, learning it, respecting what had worked, fixing only what was actually broken. What was actually broken, by November, was the heating system in the north wing, a section of the root cellar floor that had heaved over summer, and Gideon's left lung, which Dr. Pruitt had begun visiting to check on with a frequency that told its own story without any words being needed. Gideon was not a man who surrendered to illness gracefully. He fought it the only way he knew, by refusing to acknowledge it as long as possible, which meant continuing to ride out to the range on mornings when he shouldn't have, continuing to sit in the office with the ledgers until late in the evening, continuing to attend to the business of the ranch with the same meticulous attention he'd given it for 4 decades. The body's argument against all of this was increasingly persuasive, but Gideon's stubbornness had always outpaced persuasion, and so there was a period of several months in which the ranch operated under a kind of double authority, Gideon's formal command and Silas's practical management, and navigating that required more delicacy than Silas had been expecting. The first serious test of this arrangement came in December, 3 months after the wedding. A cold front moved through the valley with more violence than anyone had forecast, dropping temperatures far enough that the southern water troughs froze solid overnight. 3 of the seasonal hands who'd stayed on for winter work quit in the same week, not unreasonably because they had families and the conditions were genuinely brutal, which left the operation short-handed at precisely the wrong moment. One section of the south barn roof took damage in the wind that needed immediate repair, or they'd lose stored feed to water damage. Silas assessed the situation at 5 in the morning and made decisions in the next 2 hours that normally would have gone through Gideon first. He pulled 2 men from fence maintenance, requisitioned timber from the lower woodlot, rerouted the morning cattle movement to the east pasture where one trough was still running, and sent word to 2 neighboring operations about temporary labor. By noon, the roof was patched, the cattle were watered, and the operation was functional. Gideon came out of the house at 2 in the afternoon, moving slowly in the cold, and surveyed the result with the expression of a man taking inventory. "You didn't come to me this morning," he said. "You needed the sleep," Silas said, "and it needed to be done before 8. Gideon looked at the patched roof, at the cattle in the east pasture, at the 2 extra men working the fence line. His jaw was tight in a way that Silas had learned to recognize. Not anger exactly, but the specific tension of a man confronting his own diminishment and not yet knowing how to hold it. "You made the right calls," Gideon said finally. "I made the fast calls," Silas said. "They might not have been the same ones you'd have made." "Were they wrong?" "No. Then they were right enough." Gideon was quiet for a moment, his breath visible in the cold air. "I'm going to say something, and I need you to hear it as a fact rather than a complaint." "All right. This is still my ranch." He said it without aggression, but without softness. "Until it isn't anymore, it's mine, and decisions go through me when I'm able to make them. When I'm not—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "When I'm not, I need to know that you know the difference." "I know the difference," Silas said. "How?" "Because I'll come to you every time there's a decision to be made, and you'll tell me when you can't make it." A pause. "That's the arrangement I'd like, if it suits you." Gideon looked at him for a long moment. The cold moved between them. "That suits me," he said. They went inside, and Eliza had coffee waiting, and nobody said anything about how significant the last 10 minutes had been, because some conversations announced themselves loudly enough that commenting on them would be redundant. That was the moment the transition actually began. Not at the wedding, not at the handshake in the office, not at any formal or legal point of transfer. It began with 2 men standing in the cold in front of a patched barn roof, negotiating the space between authority and capability with more honesty than those negotiations usually got. It was not always that clean afterward. There were arguments, not loud ones. Neither man was built for shouting, but the kind of grinding, persistent disagreements that wear at the edges of things over time. Gideon had opinions about cattle movement patterns that were based on 30 years of watching the same land respond to the same seasons, and those opinions were usually right, but not always. And the times they weren't right were the times Silas found most difficult, because suggesting that Gideon was wrong required a particular kind of care that he was still learning. Eliza navigated between them with the same practical directness she brought to everything, which meant she told both of them when they were being difficult, equally and without apparent favoritism, which they both resented and both needed. She was the better part of all of it, which Silas understood more clearly with each month that passed. Not in the way of a man who discovers his wife is smarter than he'd expected. He'd known exactly what she was from the beginning, but in the way of a man who keeps finding new dimensions to a thing he thought he'd already measured. She had her mother's patience and her father's stubbornness and a practical intelligence that operated quietly enough that people consistently underestimated it until the moment they didn't. She also had a grief she was managing that she rarely spoke about directly, and Silas learned to read it in small signs. The evening she spent longer than usual with the recipe book, the morning she rode out alone to the east pasture and came back quieter, the moments at dinner when she looked at her father with an expression she thought nobody could see. He saw it. He didn't always know what to do with it except stay close, which was not nothing. Spring arrived late that year, reluctantly, the way spring did in Montana. The snow lingering past its welcome, the ground taking longer than it should to release its frost. But it arrived. The cattle moved back to the south pasture. The calving began. The ranch's rhythm reasserted itself the way it always did, with the particular indifference to human difficulty that land has always had. Gideon spent more time on the porch that spring, not in the defeated way of a man who has given up, but in a deliberate way, as if he'd decided that watching was now as valuable as doing, and had made his peace with the transition. He watched Silas manage the spring gather with an efficiency that built on rather than replaced what Gideon had established. He watched Eliza take over the bookkeeping entirely and find 2 long-standing accounting inefficiencies that the previous bookkeeper had missed for 3 years. He watched the operation run. Some evenings, Silas came and sat on the porch beside him after the day's work was done, and they talked, sometimes about the ranch, sometimes about nothing relevant, sometimes about things Gideon had never said to anyone because there had never been anyone who fit the particular category of person you said them to. Not quite a son, not an employee. Something without a clean name that functioned like both. You know what I regret? Gideon said one evening in April. The mountains were doing what they did at this hour, catching the last light, holding it longer than the valley below. What's that? Silas said. Not the mistakes. I made plenty of those and most of them taught me something, so they were worth the cost. He was quiet for a moment. I regret the time I spent being afraid to trust my own judgment. When I was young, there were things I knew were right that I didn't act on because I was waiting to be more certain. He paused. You're never more certain. You just eventually run out of reasons to wait. Silas thought about that. Is that what the tests were? Acting on your judgment? The tests were me being afraid to trust it completely, Gideon said without embarrassment. I knew what you were within 2 weeks. The other 3 months were me making sure I wasn't wrong. He glanced sideways at Silas. I wasn't wrong. No, Silas agreed. But I understand why you checked. Do you still mind it? Silas considered this honestly. I mind the principle of it more than I mind what it was in practice, he said. Testing a man without his knowledge is a kind of manipulation, even when the intentions are good. That's a fair criticism, Gideon said. But, Silas continued, I also understand that you had one chance to get it right, and a lot depending on the outcome. He looked out at the mountains. I probably would have done something similar. I don't know if I'd have been as patient about it. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Margaret would have figured it out in a week, he said. She didn't need tests. She just knew. He said it without self-pity, just as a fact about the person she'd been. I inherited a lot from my father. Patience wasn't one of them. You were patient enough, Silas said. The porch settled into one of its comfortable silences. A nighthawk called from somewhere above the tree line, and the first stars were appearing above the eastern mountains, and the ranch below them was settling into its nighttime sounds. The last movements of cattle, the horses in the corral shifting weight, the bunkhouse lamp coming on. She's happy, Gideon said quietly. Most days, Silas said, not every day. Good, Gideon said. If she was happy every day, I'd know something was wrong. It was the summer of 1890 when Eliza told Silas she was pregnant, on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen, in a tone of voice that was attempting to be matter-of-fact and not quite succeeding. Silas was drinking coffee, and he set the cup down and looked at her, and she was already prepared for a measured response, because that was what she expected from him. Measured, careful, considered. Instead, he stood up from the table and pulled her into his arms without saying anything at all. And she stood in the kitchen with her face against his chest and let herself be held, which was something she had spent 30 years not knowing how to do and was slowly learning. Good, he said finally into her hair. Just good, she said. I don't have a better word right now. She didn't need a better word. They told Gideon that evening. He was on the porch, as he often was, and he looked at his daughter when she said it, and something moved across his face that he didn't try to control. Something unguarded and complete, the expression of a man who has been handed something he had not allowed himself to hope for. He reached out and took her hand, held it, didn't say anything for a long moment. Boy or girl? He said finally. I don't know yet, Eliza said. If it's a boy, Gideon said, I'd like him to have my father's name, not mine. My father was a better man than I was, and nobody remembers him. What was his name? Silas asked. Gideon, he said, and smiled at his own answer. My mother didn't have much imagination when she was tired. Eliza laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that lives in the body rather than just the throat. The kind that happens when something genuinely lands, when the moment breaks through all the weight sitting around it, and for a few seconds everything is just what it is. The boy was born in March of 1891, early and fast and loud about it, which the midwife said was a good sign, and which Silas privately interpreted as the child announcing that he planned to be heard. They named him Gideon, not as a gesture or a sentiment, but because the old man had asked and the name was right, and sometimes the right thing is also the simple thing. Gideon held his grandson the evening of the birth, in the chair by the bedroom window, while the March wind pressed against the glass and the lamp made the room small and yellow and warm against the cold outside. He held him with the careful, particular attention of someone who understands the fragility of what they're holding and refuses to pretend otherwise. The baby was asleep. Gideon looked at his face for a long time. Silas was in the doorway. Eliza was sleeping finally after a long and difficult labor, and the house was quiet around them. "He's got her jaw," Gideon said. "He's got her lungs," Silas said. "He's been announcing himself since before noon." Gideon's mouth curved slightly. He didn't look up from the baby's face. "My father had a saying," he said. "He used to say that the land doesn't care what your name is. It only cares what you do to it." A pause. "I've thought about that my whole life. It took me until I was 60 to understand he wasn't just talking about land." Silas crossed the room and sat in the chair beside him. They sat together in the lamplight with the baby between them, the old man and the younger one, and the weight of the room, the history in it, the grief and the work and the love that had accumulated in this house over 40 years, sat around them without pressing. "I'm going to tell you something," Gideon said. "All right. I spent 4 months testing you because I was afraid." He kept his eyes on the baby. "Not afraid you'd fail. I was afraid I'd been wrong about you, and the only way I knew to check was to watch." He paused. "The real test wasn't any of the things I arranged." Silas waited. "The real test was the morning Copper died," Gideon said. "Everything else was just me confirming what I'd already seen." He finally looked up. "A man who grieves a horse he didn't own, who stays in the mud for 20 minutes with no audience and no reward, that man doesn't need to prove anything else." His voice was steady. "I just needed to be sure I wasn't seeing what I wanted to see." Silas was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the river. "Were you?" he said. "Seeing what you wanted to see?" "No," Gideon said. "I wasn't." The baby made a small sound and then settled back into sleep. And Gideon looked down at him again with that expression that had nothing practiced in it. "Take care of her," he said. Not to the baby, to Silas. "Not the way a man takes care of a fragile thing. She's not fragile. Take care of her the way you'd want someone to take care of something that matters." "I know," Silas said. "I know you know," Gideon said. "I'm saying it anyway. Old men repeat themselves. It's one of the privileges." He passed away in October of that year, on a Sunday, in his own bed, with Eliza beside him and the sound of the ranch coming in through the window he'd asked them to leave open, even though the morning was cold. The mountains were clear that day, sharply clear, the way they got in autumn, the kind of clarity that seemed almost aggressive after a summer of heat haze. He'd been declining since August, slowly and then faster, and by the end he was sleeping most of the day. But on that last morning he was awake and clear-eyed for a few hours, and he and Eliza talked, though what they said was between the two of them. Silas stayed in the hallway. He understood that some rooms, at some moments, belonged to the people inside them. When Eliza came out, her face was dry and very still, and she stood in the hallway and Silas put his arms around her, and she put her forehead against his shoulder and breathed, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying. They buried him on the rise above the river bend, where you could see the whole ranch, because there was nowhere else that made sense. Hector organized the hands without being asked. Old Devereaux, who was now 64 and deafer than ever, and had stayed on past any reasonable retirement age because the ranch was the only thing he knew, stood at the graveside with his hat against his chest and his face working hard at stillness and not entirely succeeding, and nobody commented on it. After, when the people had gone and the ranch had returned to its ordinary sounds, Silas walked up to the rise alone and stood there for a while looking at the place Gideon had chosen and at the view Gideon had looked at from his porch for 40 years. He stood there and thought about a morning 2.5 years ago when he'd knelt in the mud beside a dying horse and an old man had crouched on the other side and they'd stayed there together without speaking, and how a 20-minute silence in the dirt had changed the entire course of his life. He thought about what that meant. Not in a mystical sense, he was not a mystical man, but in the plain sense of cause and effect, how a small thing, done without calculation, had been the beginning of everything. He hadn't stayed with Copper because he thought anyone was watching. He hadn't taken his hat off at the end because it occurred to him that a grieving owner might notice. He'd done it because the horse had deserved someone to be present, and he'd been there, and so it was his job. That was it. That was the whole of it. He thought about all the ways life sorted people. The visible ways, the wealth and the name and the status, and the invisible ways underneath. The things that showed themselves only when nobody was watching, when there was nothing to gain and no audience and no reward. He thought about how the visible sorting was the one everyone paid attention to, and how the invisible sorting was the one that actually determined what a person was made of. He'd never thought of himself as a man made of anything particular. He'd been too busy working to take inventory. But standing on the rise above the river in October, with the mountains sharp and clear above the valley, and the ranch spread below him, and a son in the house who would grow up with his grandfather's name and his mother's jaw, he understood something about his own life that he hadn't had language for before. He hadn't been building toward this. He'd just been trying to do the right thing each time the right thing presented itself, without calculating what it would cost or earn him. That was all. It was a small discipline. It required no genius and no particular bravery, just the daily choice to be the same person regardless of who was in the room. He'd learned it from his own life the hard way. He suspected Gideon had learned it the same way. He suspected most useful things were learned that way. The first year after Gideon died was the hardest. Not because anything failed, nothing failed. The ranch continued its operations under Silas's management with the same functional consistency it had always had, and Eliza's involvement in the bookkeeping and business decisions made the whole operation more efficient than it had been in years. The cattle numbers were strong. The north fence held. The south branch water rights stayed settled. The hard part was the absence. The empty chair at the table, the office with the roll-top desk that Silas still knocked on before entering out of a habit that took almost 8 months to break. The porch evenings that went on without the old man's particular kind of commentary, not wise exactly, not poetic, just blunt and occasionally funny and always honest. Young Gideon started walking in February of his second year, decisively and without warning, the way he apparently intended to do everything. He walked directly into the furniture and the door frames and the legs of the kitchen table with a complete indifference to obstacles that his mother found both alarming and entirely familiar. Eliza watched her son one morning as he stood at the kitchen window looking out at the corral with an expression of absolute concentrated attention, the kind of look that a very small person turns on a thing they intend to understand completely. "He's going to be trouble," Silas said from the doorway. "He's going to be fine," Eliza said. "He just needs to hit his head on enough things first." "That's not comforting." "No," she agreed, "but it's true." She said it the way she said most things, plainly without apology, with the specific quality of a woman who has stopped performing softness. She doesn't feel and has discovered somewhere in the last 3 years that this version of herself is both more honest and considerably more comfortable to live inside. She was not her mother, she was not her father. She was something assembled from both of them and from 15 years of managing a ranch under difficult circumstances, and from the specific education of loving a quiet, honest man who fixed things without being asked and stayed in the cold until the work was done. She was 33 years old, and she was still learning who she was, which she had decided was not a failure but simply the condition of being alive and paying attention. Silas watched her watch their son and thought about a garden wall in June 2 years ago, and a woman who'd said, "Say it badly, that's fine," and had meant it, and he thought that was probably the moment he'd understood. Not that he loved her, he'd known that for months, but that she was the kind of person who would rather have the awkward truth than the polished version, and that this was rare, and that he should not let it go. He had not let it go. The Blackridge ranch continued, not because it was untouchable, not because it had been built on anything magical or permanent, but because the people responsible for it understood that a thing worth keeping requires daily maintenance. The same unglamorous, repetitive, honest attention that Silas had given to every fence and every account and every task since the day he'd arrived. The land didn't care what your name was. It cared what you did to it. Gideon's father had known that. Gideon had built a life on it. Now Silas was building one too. Years passed the way years do. Not smoothly, not without loss, not without the grinding difficulties of running a large operation through weather and market changes and the ordinary disasters that working land accumulates. They lost a barn to lightning in the summer of 1893. They lost a significant portion of the herd to disease the following winter. They had 2 bad years followed by a very good one, which was the rhythm of the business, and had always been the rhythm of the business. Through all of it, the roll-top desk stayed in the office. Silas stopped knocking on the door. He sat at the desk that Gideon had built from timber he'd cut himself, the heavy crooked desk with the drawer that never closed quite right, and he ran the operation with the same accounting discipline that had made him write down 70 cents of expenses on a cattle trip 5 years earlier. He never changed that habit. There was no audience for it. There never had been. That was, in the end, the whole point. Old Devereaux finally retired in 1894 at 67 after he fell asleep standing up during a cattle sort and woke up in the south pasture with no clear memory of how he'd gotten there. Silas gave him the small foreman's cabin on the east side of the property and told him the rent was the occasional advice, which Devereaux called a swindle and accepted immediately. Hector stayed until his own knees gave out the following year, and he left with a handshake and a sum of money that Silas had been accumulating toward for 3 years without mentioning it to anyone. And Hector said nothing when he received it except that it was too much, and Silas said the bill for 19 years of putting up with Gideon was considerable, and Hector laughed for the first time in what might have been several months. Young Gideon grew. He had his grandfather's first name and his mother's jaw and his father's specific quality of attention. That stillness in the presence of things that mattered, that refusal to be hurried by an audience. He also had a stubbornness that appeared to have been contributed by everyone in equal measure, and that manifested primarily as an absolute conviction that he could fix any piece of broken equipment on the ranch himself, which was not always correct, but was always sincere. On the boy's 8th birthday, Silas took him out to the north fence line, the 3 miles along the rocky ridge above the river that 3 foremen had called impossible, and that one young ranch hand had fixed over 11 days with 2 men and a mule string. He showed him the anchor points in the limestone, explained how the grade worked against a wagon, but not a mule, showed him the section they'd had to redo after the rainstorm, which was still the strongest section of the whole line because they'd had to build it twice. "Why did you do it?" the boy asked. The other men said it couldn't. Silas looked out at the fence, 7 years old now, still solid, still holding. "Because it could," he said. They were looking for the posts where posts had always gone. I looked where the rock was actually solid. The boy considered this. "That sounds simple." "Most things are simpler than people make them," Silas said. "Not easier, simpler." He looked at his son on the ridge above the Blackridge River, the mountains at their back and the whole ranch below them in the afternoon light, and he thought about a 66-year-old man kneeling in the mud beside a dying horse and the 20 minutes of silence that had preceded everything. He thought about what it meant to be seen clearly by someone who was paying real attention. How rare that was. How much depended on it. "Your grandfather built all of this," he said. "And you," the boy said. "He built it first," Silas said. "I just tried not to break what he left." The boy was quiet for a moment, looking at the fence line, at the ranch, at the mountains. "I want to build something," he said. "You will," Silas said. "You've got time." They rode back down the ridge together in the late afternoon, father and son, and the fence held behind them the way it had always held, the way it would go on holding long after either of them was there to check it, because it had been built right the first time by a man who understood that the hard thing and the right thing were frequently the same thing, and who had never once needed an audience to know the difference. The mountains caught the last light and held it. Below them, the Blackridge Ranch breathed its evening sounds into the cooling air. And somewhere in the house on the low rise above the river, in the kitchen with the worn floorboards and the recipe book on the shelf, Eliza Blackridge, Eliza Boone now, though she'd never fully stopped being her father's daughter, took an apple from the bowl on the table and cut it open and tasted it before she measured out the sugar. She thought about what she was working with. She adjusted accordingly.